In the heart of Rome, beneath layers of ancient stone, lies a vault shrouded in mystery, sealed off from the world for centuries. The Vatican Archives. Guarded by time and cloaked in silence, these hallowed halls conceal secrets once whispered across the sands of Egypt. Pharaohs, forgotten scrolls, and forbidden knowledge. Not buried beneath pyramids, but hidden deep within the church's most sacred chambers. Tonight, we step into the shadows of history, winding through candlelit corridors, tracing the echoes of ancient symbols, to uncover a forgotten connection between two colossal powers, the kingdom of the Nile and the authority of the papacy. Let your mind drift through the corridors of time as we unveil the Egyptian secrets hidden within the Vatican Archives. Now dim the lights, let the outside world fade and settle in. We're about to uncover the Egyptian secrets the Vatican never meant for you to see. It may surprise you that some of the oldest Egyptian artifacts in Europe are not housed in the British Museum or the Louvre, but buried beneath the surface of Vatican City. At just over 100 acres, the world's smallest country contains one of history's most extensive and secretive archives. The Vatican Apostolic Archives, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archives until 2019, stretch for more than 50 meters through underground corridors, hidden chambers, and locked vaults. Though most famously linked to Catholic history, these archives also house a collection of ancient materials from Egyptium dating back to the Ptolemaic period. The Roman Empire annexed Egypt in 30 BCE after the defeat of Cleopatra VII and Mark Antony by Octavian, later known as Augustus. With that conquest came centuries of plunder, religious appropriation, and quiet admiration for the land of pyramids and hieroglyphs. Some papyri, statues, and cultic objects found their way into Roman temples and later into Christian hands. Over time, these relics were quietly absorbed into the papal library, often mislabeled or misfiled as curiosities, occult threats, or forgotten fragments of a pagan world the Church sought to replace. Today, only a handful of scholars have seen what lies within those restricted shelves. Many suspect that beyond the papal bulls and royal correspondences, the Vatican has preserved texts that predate Christianity by thousands of years. Scrolls of Egyptian theology, alchemical formulas, astrological maps, and possibly even surviving fragments of the fabled Library of Alexandria. When the library burned, first under Julius Caesar in 48 BCE, and later in unknown incidents, some believe its most valuable contents were quietly relocated to Rome. The Vatican, ever conscious of its role as the guardian of eternal knowledge, may have been chosen as the final resting place. Whether out of reverence or fear, the Church has kept these relics sealed away from the world. But now, as the archives begin opening to broader scrutiny, we are left to wonder not only what has been hidden, but why and what it might mean if Egypt's oldest secrets were always waiting beneath a Christian throne. The Vatican has long prided itself on being the custodian of sacred tradition, but beneath that image lies a history of quiet acquisition. Throughout the Renaissance and into the Enlightenment, popes were not just religious leaders, but active collectors, driven by a thirst for knowledge that often exceeded the limits of orthodoxy. While Rome burned books deemed heretical, it also quietly gathered those considered too dangerous to lose. In the 16th century, when European explorers returned from Egypt carrying fragments of antiquity, amulets, funerary papyri, fragments of temple reliefs, they often brought their findings first to the papal court. Jesuit scholars, particularly active in Alexandria and Cairo, were dispatched as both missionaries and archivists. These were men fluent in Greek, Coptic, and Arabic, tasked not only with preaching the gospel, but with reporting back on theological anomalies, ritual practices, and surviving traces of pre-Christian magic. By the early 17th century, these reports had grown into dossiers, some of which still exist today in the archives' heavily restricted Fondo Jesuit. There are credible accounts of papal envoys recovering scrolls written in demonic script, an Egyptian form of writing that emerged around the 7th century BCE and survived into the Roman period. These documents, covered in curses, hymns, and invocations to gods with animal heads, were never translated for public consumption. Instead, they were cataloged in Latin under ambiguous titles like Textus Ex Oriente and locked away. Even Pope Benedict XIV, a figure of Enlightenment-era reform, once commissioned a private index of Egyptian artifacts in 1750, but that inventory was later removed from circulation. The reason was clear. Egypt was more than just a former pagan rival. Its symbols, its theology of resurrection, and its sacred geometry mirrored Christian mysteries too closely. To acknowledge those connections would be to acknowledge that the Church's story was not entirely original, and for a religion built on the authority of divine uniqueness, that was a risk the Vatican could not afford to take. Among the many objects rumored to be buried within the labyrinth shelves of the Vatican Archives is a small bundle of papyrus scrolls tied with faded red twine, supposedly dated to the reign of Ptolemy XII Auleatus, who ruled from 80 to 51 BCE. The scrolls are said to contain a sequence of hymns written in praise of Isis, recorded in a mixture of Greek and late demonic. Though no official record of these hymns exists in the Vatican's public catalogs, references to them have surfaced in the handwritten journals of a German Jesuit scholar named Athanasius Kircher, who studied in Rome during the 17th century. Kircher, a polymath who obsessed over Egyptian lore, believed that Isis worship had influenced the earliest Christian veneration of Mary.
This idea, while radical, was not without precedent. The image of the mother holding her divine child had existed in Egyptian iconography for over 1,000 years before the birth of Christ. Horus was often shown suckling at the breast of Isis, an image nearly identical to later statues of Madonna and child. Kircher's private correspondences mention a Labellus Marianus Egyptus, a little Marian book from Egypt, which he believed had been stored by Vatican officials in a sealed cabinet. If this manuscript exists, it may be one of the earliest theological texts to reveal how Christian imagery emerged from older Egyptian motifs. Whether this was a deliberate transformation or a subconscious absorption is still debated, but the implications are profound. The Church's refusal to disclose these connections suggests a long-standing discomfort with how close Egypt and Christianity truly are in form, structure, and even doctrine. These hidden scrolls, if they are ever released, would challenge not only our understanding of Egyptian religion, but also the origins of Christian symbology. And perhaps that is why they remain sealed behind centuries of silence. In the end, it is not the strangeness of Egyptian belief that frightens the Church. It is the familiarity. In the early 3rd century CE, Alexandria was one of the most volatile intellectual battlegrounds in the Roman Empire. It was a city where Hellenistic philosophy, Jewish mysticism, and early Christianity collided against the crumbling facade of the old Egyptian gods. It was also home to the catechetical school of Alexandria, the most important center of Christian theological development in the East at the time. Yet beneath that flowering of doctrine and debate was a darker effort: the systematic disappearance of Egypt's religious texts. As Christianity spread under Roman patronage following Constantine's conversion in the 4th century, bishops in Alexandria, particularly Cyril of Alexandria, began aggressively dismantling temples and burning what they deemed heretical scrolls. But not all of it was lost. Some documents were seized rather than destroyed, boxed and sent up the imperial supply lines toward Constantinople and later to Rome. There are records in the Vatican's Archivio Segreto of shipments labeled simply Reliquia Egyptiorum, Egyptian remnants, that arrived between 431 and 451 CE during the Council of Ephesus and the Council of Chalcedon. These gatherings were pivotal in defining Christ's nature and combating any lingering doctrines that resembled Eastern dualism or pagan cosmology. The relics from Egypt, mostly theological, were quietly absorbed into the newly forming Catholic canon as negative examples, their content locked away rather than confronted. Some texts referenced deified rulers, a divine trinity of Father, Mother, and Child, and resurrection narratives that predated Christian theology by millennia. These echoes were not lost on the theologians of the time, and their solution was simple: silence. The scrolls were sealed, their locations redacted, their symbols, in time, demonized. In doing so, the Church buried not just the words, but the memory of an entire system of belief that once rivaled its own. Today, all that remains of these early acquisitions are faint notations in ink, the kind made by clerks who never intended anyone to ask questions. But in those margins, Egypt still breathes. If you ever walk through St. Peter's Square and look toward the center, you'll see a towering obelisk standing silently over the cobblestones. What most tourists don't realize is that the structure before them is not Roman in origin, it is Egyptian. Originally erected by an unknown pharaoh, this red granite obelisk once stood in Heliopolis over 2,000 years ago, long before Christianity was born. Emperor Caligula had it transported to Rome in 37 CE, and it was eventually placed in the center of Nero's circus, where early Christians were executed. Centuries later, in 1586, Pope Sixtus V ordered it moved to its present location outside the Vatican Basilica, declaring it a symbol of Christian triumph over paganism. But what if that story was never quite so simple? Hidden in Vatican Architectural Archives are drawings and annotations from the Renaissance engineers who moved the obelisk, including Domenico Fontana. In one of his lesser-known letters, Fontana alluded to inscriptions found beneath the obelisk's base, hieroglyphs that had been deliberately scraped off in antiquity, possibly by Roman priests who feared the sacred power they carried. These markings, according to Fontana, were not idle decorations, but something closer to a code, an ancient invocation. Some believe that transcripts of the erased inscriptions were copied and placed in the Vatican's inner archive under the Codices Egypti collection, where they remain untranslated to this day. Why such secrecy over a stone already stripped of its meaning? Perhaps because the Church feared it still held something dangerous. In ancient Egypt, obelisks were not monuments. They were living pillars, channeling the sun god Ra and anchoring cosmic order on earth. To place one at the heart of the Catholic world may have symbolized dominance, but it also risked importing something older than Christianity itself, something that still watches unmoved as the centuries pass. In the early 20th century, the Vatican faced an unexpected crisis, not from Protestant reformers or secular governments, but from within its own scholarly circles. A small group of Jesuit historians working in Cairo had uncovered fragments of a manuscript in the monastery of St. Paul the Anchorite near the Red Sea. The text, written in Coptic and translated from older Egyptian traditions, appeared to describe a pre-Christian resurrection ritual centered around Osiris. Unlike the usual funerary texts, this version contained elements uncomfortably close to Christian sacraments: a death, a burial, a descent into darkness, and a return in divine form. The Jesuits, led by Father Michel Aboud, were startled not only by the content, but by its reverence, its poetic cadence, and its eerie familiarity. Fearing theological controversy, the Vatican recalled the team and quietly removed the manuscript from Egyptian soil. Today, the scroll, identified only as Fragmentum Osiridis IX, stored in a climate-controlled vault inside the Vatican Library. It has never been published in full. In the vast, rarely discussed sublevels beneath the Vatican museums, beyond the displays open to tourists, lies a chamber known only to a few curators and archivists. Among its most unusual contents is a relic unlike anything commonly associated with Christianity: a mummified hand, delicately wrapped in linen, adorned with gold rings bearing the cartouche of an early 18th dynasty ruler. There is no public record of how or when this artifact arrived in Rome, though internal documents from the Vatican's Museum of Ethnology suggest it may have been brought to Europe by Italian soldiers returning from Napoleon's Egyptian campaign around 181. What's particularly strange is that the object was never catalogued alongside other ancient artifacts. Instead, it was quietly moved to a private ecclesiastical collection reserved for items deemed theologically disruptive. The Church has always been cautious about relics that blur the line between veneration and idolatry, and this hand seems to occupy a troubling space between the two. In ancient Egypt, mummified limbs were sometimes removed intentionally from royal bodies and given as protective talismans to priests. The presence of such an object inside the Vatican, a place that publicly condemns necromancy and occult symbolism, raises obvious contradictions. Yet the hand remains, housed in a glass case, watched by a camera, and never displayed. Some whisper that its presence was once used in secretive theological discussions about the universality of resurrection. That if a pharaoh could preserve his body and soul for eternity, perhaps the principle of eternal life existed before Christianity and outside of it. Of course, no official church doctrine supports this idea, but the fact that this relic has not been destroyed or discarded suggests something more complex.
The Church may condemn paganism, but it does not always erase it. Sometimes it simply locks the door and swallows the key. In 1667, a Jesuit priest named Father Lorenzo Vitelli recorded a peculiar event in his travel journals during a stay in Cairo. He had been granted access to a private Coptic library maintained by a desert monastic order, and came upon a fragmented codex describing a device referred to as the Eye of the Sky. The text was obscure, heavily metaphorical, but it made reference to an object capable of observing distant lands and even past events. Father Vitelli, who had already sent several rare manuscripts back to Rome under orders from the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, included this codex in his next shipment. Upon arrival in the Vatican, it was placed into the restricted shelves of the Arkham Secret and noted in Latin as Fragmentum Oculi Aetheris. Most dismissed it as symbolic mysticism. But centuries later, in the 1950s, interest in the fragment was quietly revived when Cardinal Eugene Tisserant, then head of the Vatican Library, allegedly ordered a new translation. What he found disturbed him. The language in the codex bore striking resemblance to theoretical ideas emerging in modern physics and optics, concepts involving light, memory, and spatial recording that should not have existed in the ancient world. Though no official publication followed, references to the fragment appear in Tisserant's private annotations, including a phrase that stands out: "More than myth, less than machine." This has led some researchers to connect Fragmentum Oculi Aetheris with the legendary chronovisor, a rumored Vatican device said to allow visions of the past. While the existence of such a machine remains unverified, the link to an Egyptian source document raises unsettling questions. Could remnants of ancient Egyptian science or ritual technology have survived long enough to influence secret church experiments? If the Eye of the Sky was more than a symbol, then the boundary between myth and history is thinner than we imagined. And perhaps the Vatican knows that better than anyone else.
Not all secrets hidden beneath Vatican vaults wear the cloak of mythology. Some are cold, tangible, and documented, though never made public. One such case revolves around a set of letters written by an early 20th century Egyptian scholar named Dr. Nabil Ferreira, who studied theology in Rome during the 1920s. Ferreira had been granted rare access to certain archival materials as part of a joint academic initiative between the Pontifical Biblical Institute and Al-Azhar University. During his research, Ferreira stumbled upon references to a translated correspondence between the Roman Emperor Nero and St. Paul that, according to Ferreira's personal diary, contained specific discussions of Egyptian religious rituals and even mentions of the cult of Serapis. Serapis was a syncretic Greco-Egyptian god whose following had spread across the Roman Empire and had long been viewed as a theological rival to the emerging Christian faith. What disturbed Ferreira was that the tone of the letters did not portray Serapis as an object of scorn, but as a figure of consideration, perhaps even respect. One passage, which he copied by hand before being denied further access, stated, "There is wisdom in the rites of the East, even where idols mask it." Ferreira sent a report to colleagues in Cairo, but the response was silence. Within a year, he returned to Egypt and abruptly abandoned his ecclesiastical studies. The original letters he viewed have never been located in any Vatican index. Officially, no such correspondence between Nero and Paul exists, but Vatican archivists have quietly acknowledged that several early Christian documents, once labeled non-doctrinalia, were reclassified during the 1940s and sealed for diplomatic reasons. It remains unclear whether these texts were hidden to preserve theological consistency or to prevent unrest. What is certain is that Dr. Ferreira believed he had seen something that shook the core of the apostolic story, a glimpse into a time when Egyptian theology still sat at the same table as the gospel. And perhaps that was a truth the Church could not allow to surface. At the height of the Renaissance, as Europe looked to the stars and rediscovered the lost sciences of the ancients, the Vatican found itself both sponsor and censor of knowledge. Nowhere was this tension more apparent than in the Church's handling of sacred geometry.
Buried within a folio of architectural blueprints, once belonging to Donato Bramante, the chief architect of St. Peter's Basilica under Pope Julius II, are a series of sketches and notes that appear to be heavily influenced by Egyptian mathematical proportions. Among them is a diagram nearly identical in ratio and alignment to the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. This diagram, annotated in Latin, includes the phrase mensura divina in structura antigesima, divine measure in the most ancient structure. At first glance, it could be seen as a Renaissance curiosity, yet it's accompanied by references to Egyptian builders and biblical analogies such as Enoch, who is described in apocryphal texts as a keeper of celestial knowledge. The Vatican never publicly acknowledged these blueprints. They remained tucked into a sealed architectural dossier until 1929, when they were briefly examined by Monsignor Ludwig Kaas, a German priest and antiquarian. His notes mention the presence of an Oriental schema of resurrection, linking the layout of Giza's pyramids to certain floor plans of early Christian basilicas. The implication is subtle, but radical. That the structures built by Catholic architects were not merely Christian, but cosmically aligned, using principles drawn from ancient Egypt. If true, it would mean that some of Christianity's most sacred spaces carry silent echoes of pyramidic order and sun worship. The Church has consistently denied any theological borrowing from Egypt, preferring to frame its visual culture as a break from paganism. But inside the archives, paper and ink tell a different story. Perhaps faith was never as separate from the past as we were told. Perhaps the stones of St. Peter's sit atop an older blueprint, one traced in sand beneath the eyes of ancient gods. In a forgotten corner of the Vatican's vast manuscript repository lies a collection labeled Zodiacum Vetustus, a title that translates simply as the ancient zodiac. Unlike the star charts commonly associated with Greco-Roman cosmology, these documents are believed to derive from Egyptian astronomical traditions, particularly those found on the ceiling of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera. The Dendera zodiac, carved in stone during the late Ptolemaic period, is a detailed celestial diagram that charts stars, planets, and constellations using a symbolic system unique to Egyptian thought. In the early 19th century, when Napoleon's campaign in Egypt led to the looting of the Dendera relief and its removal to the Louvre, copies of the original were made, some of which found their way to Rome. What sets the Vatican's version apart is its inclusion of annotations in Coptic and Latin, along with marginal notes written by Jesuit astronomers who believed the Egyptian zodiac encoded prophetic cycles. A Jesuit named Paolo Maria Carafa, who studied the texts in the 1840s, reportedly warned that certain planetary alignments described in the scrolls seemed to foreshadow periods of great spiritual upheaval, including dates eerily close to the French Revolution and the rise of fascism in Italy. The Church, already cautious about astrology and its potential to undermine divine providence, ordered the scrolls restricted. They were placed in a locked vault beneath the Apostolic Library and have remained unseen by the public ever since. What makes these documents so dangerous is not their predictions, but their precision. Ancient Egyptian astrologers did not simply gaze at stars. They believed the heavens mirrored the divine order on earth, that celestial movements could alter fate, kingship, even the breath of gods. If Vatican scholars once feared these charts, perhaps they were because they glimpsed a system too coherent, too old, and far too close to the divine mechanics the Church claimed as its own. And so the stars of Dendera remained silent, buried not in sand, but in secrecy. It was in 1898, during a quiet reorganization of the Vatican's ethnographic collection, that a wooden crate was discovered deep within a sealed storeroom. Inside were fragments of carved ivory, linen wrappings, and a smaller tablet bearing the name of a priest of Thoth, the Egyptian god of wisdom and writing. The pieces had no accompanying inventory. There was no record of when they arrived, who delivered them, or under whose authority they had been stored. The only clue was a faded shipping label in Italian marked Porto della Orno, 1850,
a known exit point for relics smuggled out of Egypt during the Napoleonic period.
What puzzled Vatican curators most, however, was not the presence of Egyptian remains, but the symbols etched into the ivory tablet. Among the hieroglyphs were 3 signs that closely resembled characters used in early Christian cryptographies, specifically the staurogram, a symbol that combines the Greek letters tau and rho, often used in the earliest manuscripts to denote the cross of Christ. Scholars familiar with both scripts found the resemblance unsettling. It was either a coincidence of symbols across cultures, or it pointed to something more complicated, a transference of sacred signs that predated Christianity. In the decades that followed, the artifact was quietly moved to the Museum Missionario Ethnologico, where access remains strictly controlled. Though it has never been placed on public display, internal correspondence confirms that several popes, including Pius XI and Paul VI, were made aware of its existence. Neither took public interest. Instead, the object became another buried artifact filed away with the strange and unclassifiable. But to those who have studied its markings, the ivory tablet stands as a challenge to historical orthodoxy. It suggests that symbols central to Christian identity may have traveled a longer road than we were taught, passing through Egyptian hands, inscribed on forgotten shrines, long before they were etched into stone in Rome. And perhaps that is what the Church fears most. Not that Egypt corrupted Christianity, but that it quietly fathered it. In 1963, during the height of the Second Vatican Council, a young scholar named Father Henri Maillard was granted temporary access to a restricted section of the Apostolic Archive to assist with cataloging ancient correspondence. Among the stacks of diplomatic letters and royal petitions, he encountered a weathered scroll case labeled simply Egypt Confessio Extra Canonum. Inside was a vellum-bound manuscript copied from an earlier Coptic text, its origin traced to the monastery of Saint Shenouda in Upper Egypt. The manuscript was unusual in both content and tone. It did not read like a sermon or a biblical commentary, but more like a confession, not given to a priest, but spoken to something older and faceless. The text told the story of a Christian abbot tormented by dreams of Thoth, the ibis-headed Egyptian god of sacred knowledge. In these dreams, the abbot was shown a library buried beneath the sands near Memphis, filled with books bound in copper and inked with indigo, containing wisdom deemed forbidden even to angels. The abbot described his fear that this knowledge, if ever unearthed, would shatter the fragile veil between Christian doctrine and Egyptian memory. He begged the Church not to pursue it. What disturbed Father Maillard most was that this manuscript was not treated as myth or metaphor. It had been catalogued as theological testimony and sealed by a papal secretary in the early 15th century. When Maillard brought the manuscript to his supervisor, he was instructed to return it and speak of it no further. He later wrote in a private letter, never intended for publication, "There are truths in this building we are not meant to translate, not because they are false, but because they are too old." Whether the abbot's dreams were hallucination, allegory, or something more, the Church responded the way it often has, with silence and storage. And so the confession remained unread, the knowledge buried both in sand and in vault, as if some wisdom is not lost by accident, but kept hidden by design. In the cool, echoing corridors beneath a Signing Hall, there exists a map room known only to a few archivists. It is not listed on public blueprints of the Vatican Library, nor is it accessible without explicit clearance from the apostolic prefect. This room houses cartographic relics from across the world, many predating modern nation-states.
Among them is a parchment scroll acquired in the early 17th century from a Jesuit mission near Luxor. The scroll is not a map in the conventional sense, but a diagram, symbolic alignment of stars, rivers, and pyramids, annotated in faded demotic and accompanied by Latin translations. What makes this document extraordinary is its orientation. It does not place Egypt at the center of the world, nor Jerusalem, nor Rome. Instead, it focuses on a small segment of the Nile, where, according to a translated note, the threshold between earth and the realm of the Watchers stands open.
Jesuit records indicate that this phrase was interpreted by early missionaries as referencing a liminal space, part ritual, part astronomical, part metaphysical. The scroll aligns the rising of Sirius with specific festivals of Osiris, but it also includes cryptic notations about sacred directionality and the descent of divine knowledge into stone. After being brought to the Vatican, the scroll was reviewed by papal astronomers and promptly locked away. Theologians feared it implied that ancient Egyptian cosmology was not merely symbolic, but designed to interface with divine forces. In 1743, Pope Benedict XIV briefly reopened the scroll's dossier, only to reseal it under a clause reserved for materials posing doctrinal confusion to the faithful. Since then, it has remained hidden. Modern astrophysicists who have glimpsed low-resolution photographs of the scroll note a startling precision in the stellar arrangements, suggesting knowledge of axial precession centuries before Hipparchus. If true, it would mean the ancient Egyptians were not merely myth-makers, but mathematicians mapping a spiritual architecture that Rome quietly inherited, even as it buried the evidence beneath its altar. During the pontificate of Leo XIII in the late 19th century, the Vatican oversaw a surge in archaeological interest across the Mediterranean. Excavations in Egypt, often spearheaded by European institutions, were closely monitored by the Holy See for relics of Christian antiquity, but for what church scholars referred to as pre-evangelical distortions. Among these monitored digs was a lesser-known site in Middle Egypt where Jesuit missionaries partnered with local monks to recover scroll fragments from what appeared to be a priest's library near the ruins of Hermopolis, the city sacred to Ptah. Most of the texts were degraded, barely legible, but one stood out, a copper-framed codex describing a ritual known as the Rite of the Hidden Voice. It claimed to summon divine intelligence through recitation of tones matched to planetary movements. The process was written in exacting detail, with mathematical tables, lunar alignments, and sacrificial protocols. When these documents reached Rome in 1885, they were not filed with the ethnographic collection, but handed directly to the Vatican Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Internal memos reveal concern that the ritual bore similarities to early Christian monastic chants, particularly those practiced by desert anchorites in Egypt during the 3rd and 4th centuries. In private letters, one cardinal remarked that the chant structure echoed the structure of Gregorian plain chant, though with harmonic frequencies more akin to Sufi or Coptic tonal systems. If such parallels were acknowledged, it would mean that the sacred sounds of Christianity, long held to be divinely revealed, might have originated in the liturgies of Egyptian temples. Rather than confront that possibility, the Vatican shelved the scroll and moved its copper frame to a locked vault. No further mention of the right of the hidden voice was made in public ecclesiastical records. Yet those who read the scroll noted that its final lines warned, "He who silences the voice still answers to it." Perhaps that silence still echoes in Rome's deepest rooms. In 1935, a young Egyptian archivist named Selm Anwar was sent to Rome as part of a diplomatic initiative between the Coptic Orthodox Church and the Vatican. Fluent in Arabic, Latin, and Greek, Anwar was granted limited access to select archival materials relating to early Christian correspondence in Egypt. What he found, however, was not a letter or theological commentary, but a small, undecorated codex labeled Canon Mysterii Memphicii, or Rule of the Memphite Mystery. The manuscript, written in Latin and copied from an earlier Coptic source, outlined a set of teachings attributed not to any Christian saint, but to Ptah, ancient creator god of Memphis, the city once regarded as the spiritual heart of Lower Egypt. The text described creation not through divine command, but through articulation, suggesting that the world was spoken into being through vibrations, sound, and thought. These ideas may sound abstract, but they paralleled certain Christian doctrines about the Logos, a word used in the Gospel of John to describe Christ. Anwar, disturbed by the implications noted in his journal that the language of Ptah and the Logos were not only compatible, but nearly identical in structure. Could early Christian writers have borrowed this Egyptian concept of creation through speech? When Anwar presented his notes to the Vatican curator overseeing his visit, his access was immediately revoked.
He returned to Egypt and never spoke publicly about the discovery again. Years later, the manuscript was quietly moved to a sealed archive, where it remains under ecclesiastical restriction. Its existence is not denied, but its significance is dismissed as allegorical, poetic relic of a pagan worldview. And yet, the parallels remain. If creation through divine utterance originated in Memphis rather than Bethlehem, the very foundations of Christian metaphysics shift. Perhaps the Logos was not born, but inherited. And if the Church knows this, its silence is not ignorance, it is strategy. In the margins of a faded Jesuit travelogue dated 172, there is a brief but unsettling annotation. Anubis appears on Roman marble, not as myth, but as judge. The note was scribbled by Brother Matteo Lancelotti, who had spent 3 years in Upper Egypt mapping early Christian monasteries and interviewing local clergy. Upon his return to Rome, he had been tasked with organizing fragments from a shipment of archaeological finds sent from Thebes. Among the contents was a carved limestone relief, later identified as Greco-Egyptian in style, depicting the figure of Anubis with the traditional jackal's head, but as a robed man,
holding a scale, his fingers resting on the lips of a silent soul. What caught Lancelotti's attention was the Latin inscription beneath the figure, added centuries later: Veritatis, guardian of truth. The implication was profound. Anubis, the Egyptian god of embalming and guide of the dead, had been reimagined in Rome not as a pagan demon, but as a custodian of divine order. Rather than destroy the relief, church authorities relocated it to a private archive within the Collegio Romano, the Jesuit educational complex in Rome. It remains there, known to a few scholars as the Roman Anubis. Some believe this artifact reflects a quiet theological dilemma faced by early church leaders. How should the faithful regard pre-Christian figures who symbolized judgment, resurrection, and moral reckoning, concepts later absorbed into Christianity itself? Was Anubis to be seen as a demonic deception or as a distorted echo of divine truth? Over the centuries, the Church chose to ignore him entirely. But the marble remains, its gaze unwavering, its message uncomfortably familiar. In ancient Egyptian belief, the heart of the dead was weighed against a feather. If it was lighter, the soul passed into eternal peace. If heavier, it was devoured. There are those within the Vatican who quietly wonder if the Church inherited more than just symbols from Egypt. It may have inherited its justice. In 1921, during a papal inventory of seldom examined holdings from the missionary archives, an unassuming bundle of documents surfaced from a sealed wooden chest marked ZA 1813. Inside were several weathered letters and a curious bound text labeled Pax sub Sol, meaning peace beneath the sun. The manuscript was written in Italian, but its contents had clearly been translated from an older source, most likely Coptic or late demonic Egyptian. Its subject was no ordinary theology. It described in lyrical but precise terms a diplomatic exchange between early Roman bishops and a priestly order from Elephantine Island at the southern edge of Egypt near modern-day Aswan. The text proposed a spiritual treaty, not of conversion, but of coexistence. In it, the sun was revered as a divine presence acceptable to both traditions, so long as it was not worshipped but acknowledged as the visible sign of the invisible God. The bishop in the text, unnamed but likely based on a real early church figure, affirmed the value of Egyptian moral codes, their rituals of purification, and even their reverence for Ma'at, the principle of cosmic balance. No known church council ever acknowledged this treaty, nor is it referenced in the records of doctrinal development. Yet Pax sub Sol exists, and Vatican archivists have admitted privately that its authenticity is difficult to dispute. If accurate, the document implies that the early church did not entirely reject Egyptian spirituality. It negotiated with it. There is no heresy in acknowledging the sun, the manuscript says, only in failing to see what it points to. Such a message, though once considered harmless poetic theology, became dangerous in the modern age when the purity of doctrine was deemed inseparable from the supremacy of the Church. And so, Pax sub Sol was quietly removed from circulation, not destroyed, only hidden. Like many things in the archives, it remains in limbo, preserved,
but denied, as if waiting for a time when peace beneath the sun could be spoken of again without fear. In 1870, the Vatican was reeling from the loss of the Papal States and the declaration of Italian unification. Amid the turmoil, a little-known cleric named Father Augustine Mar was assigned to assist with reordering sensitive materials in the Archivio Chigredo. During his cataloging work, Mar encountered a dossier labeled Denazionare Ethiopico, or Concerning the Ethiopic Journey. The documents within chronicled an unofficial expedition undertaken by a Vatican-sanctioned envoy in the late 16th century to the Nile's upper reaches, beyond the traditional bounds of Christian influence. While the stated goal had been dialogue with Coptic and Ethiopian Christians, Mar's notes suggest something else. Among the recovered papers was a description of a meeting between Vatican emissaries and a group of Nubian monks living in the ruins of an ancient Egyptian temple. These monks claimed to be descendants of a priestly lineage dating back to the time of Pharaoh Tahara of the 25th dynasty, who reigned from 690 to 664 BCE. They preserved oral traditions and rituals that had survived the collapse of temple worship. What disturbed the Vatican envoy was not the content of the rituals, but their resemblance to certain elements of Catholic monasticism: chants at sunrise, ablutions before prayer, recitations honoring the cycle of life and death. These were not superficial overlaps. They implied a continuity of religious expression that preceded Christianity by centuries. According to Mar's Marginalia, the emissaries brought back several items from the encounter, including a stone talisman inscribed with both Egyptian and early Christian symbols. Upon arrival in Rome, the artifact was studied briefly and then sequestered in the basement archives of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The official report was never published. Mar, disillusioned by the experience, left the priesthood a year later. But before he did, he scribbled a final remark in the dossier's cover. The Nile flows into Rome, not by conquest, but by inheritance. It was a statement the Church never answered, because to do so would be to admit how much it owed to a river far older than the Tiber. When visitors step inside the grand basilicas of Rome, few stop to question the architectural echoes rising around them. The towering columns, the vast central naves, and the use of axial symmetry bear a striking resemblance to temple layouts not from the Holy Land, but from Egypt. This similarity is no accident. In the early 4th century, after Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity and began constructing churches throughout the empire, his architects turned to existing models of sacred space. Many of these architects were trained in Hellenistic styles that had absorbed Egyptian influences during the long centuries of Ptolemaic rule. But buried within a sealed volume in the Vatican's architectural archive is a letter from one such architect, Lucius Aurelius Modestus Sidianine, to a Roman bishop around 328 CE. In it, Modestus explains that the new basilica's design, soon to be built over what would become St. John Lateran, was directly inspired by temple forms seen in Alexandria and Philae. He even uses the term templum resurrectio per transitum, suggesting a passageway designed to evoke rebirth, an idea central to both Egyptian and Christian theology. The letter was quietly removed from circulation in the late Renaissance, likely during the papacy of Sixtus V, who sought to purge perceived pagan traces from church history. It was never officially destroyed. Instead, it was refiled in a private collection under the category Symbolica Antiqua. Modern researchers who have viewed the document say it offers clear evidence that early Christian builders did not fear Egyptian design. They studied it, adapted it, and wove it into their sacred spaces. But over time, what began as homage was reframed as triumph. The church began teaching that Christianity had replaced Egypt, not inherited it. And yet the marble still whispers. Every echo under the basilica dome carries the proportions of a much older faith. It is not a matter of opinion, but of stone. The past was never erased. It was only recarved. In 1854, as archaeological fever swept across Europe, the Vatican sent a discreet delegation to the Egyptian Delta. Officially, their mission was religious diplomacy, establish contact with local Christian communities, and protect sacred relics. But according to a series of internal memos archived under the title Mio Interans, the delegation had another undisclosed objective: to recover what was believed to be a sacred object known in Coptic lore as the Eye of Remembrance.
Described in monastic scrolls as a polished black stone used by ancient Egyptian priests during rituals of ancestral communion. The object was said to reflect not light, but memory. Though this sounds like legend, the Vatican took it seriously enough to assign a cardinal overseer to the mission, and one Jesuit priest, Father Girolamo Vecchi, recorded his belief that the artifact had applications beyond sacrament, perhaps even in time itself. When the team returned, they carried with them a sealed casket and a cryptic log entry stating only "items secured, reverence demanded, inquiry postponed." That casket now resides in the Vatican's subterranean reliquary labeled lapis ignotus, or unknown stone. It has never been displayed, never studied by independent researchers, and only referenced in passing by ecclesiastical staff. Some believe it is nothing more than a mythic curiosity, another relic with exaggerated lore. But whispers within the Pontifical Academy of Sciences suggest otherwise. In the 1970s, a Vatican technician reported that instruments placed near the casket malfunctioned, batteries drained, compasses spun. The technician was later reassigned. To this day, access to lapis ignotus remains tightly controlled, and the original field journal kept by Father Vecchi has gone missing. The object may be inert stone, or it may be something more, something that bears witness. In ancient Egyptian theology, to remember the past was to keep it alive. Perhaps that's what the stone does, and perhaps the Vatican hides it not because it is dead, but because it still remembers. In a sealed wing of the Apostolic Palace, beyond the reach of public scholars, sits an unlabeled wooden chest known to archivists only as Capella Noctissa, Chapel of Night. Within it lies a manuscript bound in goat leather, its title nearly rubbed away but still partially legible. Evangelium Sobeki, or the Gospel of Sobek. Sobek, the crocodile-headed god of the Nile, was worshipped as both a force of protection and chaos. In this manuscript, however, he is cast in an entirely different role. The text, dated to the early 2nd century and likely translated from a Coptic original, presents a series of parables in which Sobek speaks of mercy, moral purification, and resurrection. Even more striking is the use of water, as sacramental immersions in sacred pools, followed by an anointing with oil and bread. To a casual reader, these may appear to echo early Christian baptism and Eucharistic rites, but to Vatican theologians, the resemblance was far more troubling. The document was reviewed in 1911 by Monsignor Vincenzo Forencini, a scholar known for his caution. In his private analysis, he concluded that the text represents either a sophisticated parody or a lost sibling of apostolic teaching. What disturbed him most, however, was that several verses bore syntactical structure nearly identical to sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, a non-canonical text often dismissed as Gnostic. The Gospel of Sobek, if authentic, undermines the notion of Christian singularity. It suggests that doctrines of cleansing, renewal, and divine incarnation were not unique revelations, but shared spiritual concepts traveling along the Nile long before reaching Galilee. The Vatican response was swift. The manuscript was never translated in full and was placed under indefinite doctrinal review. Today, it is spoken of only in whispers among archivists who wonder if Vatican's oldest secret isn't that Egypt resisted conversion, but that it helped write the first drafts of the faith. A crocodile god with a gospel was too much to publish, so the text was buried, but the current still moves beneath the surface. In the winter of 1784, a scholar-priest named Father Louis Charbonneau arrived in Rome from Paris, carrying with him a gift for the Holy See, a tightly wrapped linen bundle acquired through a private sale from a French antiquities dealer who had recently returned from Luxor. The object was said to be a funerary relic, but it came with no identifying marks or provenance. Charbonneau believed it to be a priest's burial fragment, likely unimportant. When Vatican experts unwrapped the linen, however, they discovered a remarkably preserved mask not of gold or gilded plaster, but of carved basalt with inlaid quartz eyes that shimmered in the candlelight. What made it truly remarkable was the inscription along the inner edge of the mask, written in hieratic script and translated later by a Jesuit specialist. It read, "I have seen the faces of those who claim to rule truth. I sleep beneath their temples."
Though cryptic, the phrase immediately drew the attention of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The mask, dubbed Visio Interdicta, the Forbidden Vision, was taken into custody and placed in a velvet-lined case deep within the restricted vaults. For years, no one was allowed to examine it. Only one sketch survives in the margins of a private Vatican field report, drawn with meticulous care and accompanied by a single sentence: "Eyes too lifelike for the dead." Some within the Vatican believed the mask may have belonged to a Theban priest executed during the reign of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who promoted monotheism. Others saw it as a direct challenge to Rome's authority, a buried protest by those who saw future priests wearing their truths like masks. Whatever its origin, the artifact remains inaccessible. To look upon it was said to cause vertigo, a sense of being watched. Perhaps the mask is just stone, or perhaps it is what Egypt left behind to stare back at those who buried her truths beneath marble and mitres, not to haunt, but to remind. In 1822, as Jean-François Champollion was unlocking the Rosetta Stone and forever changing the world's understanding of Egyptian hieroglyphics, the Vatican remained curiously quiet. Publicly, church officials expressed polite interest in the decipherment. Privately, they were alarmed. For centuries, hieroglyphs had been regarded not as language, but as mystical symbols, either demonic enchantments or divine code. The belief that they could be translated like ordinary script was not only controversial, but destabilizing. In response, the Vatican commissioned its own secret project, a linguistic cross-comparison led by Father Bartol Ventresca, a Jesuit philologist with expertise in Greek, Coptic, and Syriac. Father Ventresca was given access to a small cache of untranslated stelae stored deep within the Lateran Palace, artifacts acquired by missionaries in the early 17th century and never made public. Over the next 5 years, Ventresca produced a private index titled Lexicon Hieroglyphicum Ecclesiae, a handwritten dictionary matching Egyptian symbols to Christian theological terms. What startled him and disturbed his superiors was the recurring presence of concepts tied to judgment, resurrection, divine kingship, and moral purification. These were not vague similarities, they were structural correspondences. Some phrases used to describe the soul's journey after death mirrored the language of the Nicene Creed. Others echoed the penitential prayers found in early Christian liturgies. Ventresca's work was immediately sealed. The Church, it seemed, could not risk the faithful discovering that what they believed to be uniquely Christian had once been spoken by priests standing before pyramids. Today, only fragments of the lexicon survive, copied in secret by later scholars. The original document vanished from the archive shelves sometime in the 1930s, just after the rise of papal interest in archaeological diplomacy with Egypt. Some suspect it still exists, misfiled under a false name. Others believe it was deliberately destroyed. Either way, the implications remain. If hieroglyphs carried truths that Christianity later claimed as revelation, then Egypt did not whisper in the background of church history. It spoke first, and Rome, realizing this, chose silence over echo. In the year 1609, under the patronage of Pope Paul V, a Jesuit astronomer named Brother Antonio de Fermo traveled to the ruins of Heliopolis, the center of Egyptian sun worship and one of the ancient cities known to history. Though officially there to observe celestial alignments for the Church's expanding star catalogue, de Fermo had a second unofficial purpose.
He carried with him a list of ancient Egyptian star deities and ritual names drawn from texts preserved in the Vatican's restricted Codex delle Antiquariae. His task was to identify any astronomical wisdom that might echo, challenge, or predate Christian cosmology. What he found in Heliopolis startled him. Carvings on fallen obelisks and half-buried pylons described the sun not merely as a symbol of divinity, but as an instrument of judgment. An all-seeing eye whose path across the sky recorded the moral balance of every human soul. De Fermo compared this doctrine with early Christian concepts of the Last Judgment and wrote in his private notes that the Egyptians knew the weight of sin in starlight before Christ walked among men.
His report was met with alarm. The Vatican quickly recalled him, and the notes he submitted were sealed in the Papal Observatory's private vault. According to a second-hand account written decades later, De Fermo also brought back a fragment of carved basalt bearing the name of Ra and a phrase that roughly translates to "He who shines upon the hidden." The fragment was kept under a cloth in the Vatican Observatory for years before being transferred to a classified reliquary beneath the Apostolic Palace. Why the secrecy? Perhaps it was fear that the very heavens, long considered the domain of Christian order, had once been charted, interpreted, and even worshipped in ways far too close for comfort. De Fermo's Heliopolis report was never published. He died in quiet disgrace, his legacy buried beneath the same silence that now veils the sun's earliest shrine. The stars still shine, but not all their messages are allowed to be read. In 1752, a Vatican diplomat named Monsignor Pietro Rinaldi was dispatched to the court of the Ottoman governor in Cairo. His assignment was purely political: secure protections for Christian pilgrims traveling through Upper Egypt. But during his stay, Rinaldi grew fascinated with a local legend whispered by both Muslim clerics and Coptic monks. It concerned a hidden chamber beneath the ruins of an old temple in Abydos, believed to house a papyrus known as the Chronicle of Breath. Said to be written during the reign of Seti I in the 13th century BCE, the document supposedly described a divine substance called Sa, the animating force of life, and claimed that those who mastered its rhythm could extend consciousness beyond death. Whether out of curiosity or conviction, Rinaldi paid a local scribe to guide him into the ruins. What he found there remains unclear. His field diary, preserved in the Vatican's Diplomatic Correspondence Archive, contains only fragmented notes. One page reads, "Not metaphor, not allegory. It is spoken like doctrine, but older." Upon returning to Rome, Rinaldi submitted a sealed report to the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and included a folded cloth bundle containing a brittle papyrus fragment. According to a now restricted index, the fragment is still housed in the Vatican, labeled Respiration Animae, breath of the soul. Only one scholar, Father Guglielmo Methu, was permitted to view it in 1953. He claimed the text described a process eerily similar to Christian ideas of inspiration, the indwelling of divine presence through breath.
If the Egyptian concept of Sa influenced early Christian thought on the Holy Spirit, it would mean that the breath of God had an older name. Rinaldi's account was never circulated. His final letter, addressed to a friend in Venice but intercepted by the Vatican, reads, "It is not that they knew less than we do, it is that they knew first." The Church filed his words under theological ambiguity, but others see them as the admission of a truth buried deeper than any crypt. In a quiet alcove of the Vatican Library, beneath the watchful eyes of gilded cherubs and frescoed saints, there rests a codex, bound in pale calfskin and marked with an unfamiliar sigil, winged sun framed by reeds and fire. The catalog entry, dated 1687, identifies it simply as Tractatus de Ante Divino, the Treatise of the Divine Bridge. Though its Latin title conceals its origin, the text itself is a translation of an older Egyptian manuscript obtained by Dominican friars during a mission to the monastery of Deir el-Muharraq, nestled at the foot of the Egyptian desert. The original was likely Coptic, possibly even older, and it describes a mystical structure said to exist between the world of the living and the dead. This bridge was not metaphorical. The text gave instructions, ritual preparations, prayers, and even dream incubation methods to access it. What alarmed the Vatican wasn't its content, but its structure. The treatise mirrored medieval Christian visions of the afterlife, particularly the ladder of souls described by Saints Perpetua and Benedict. The imagery was strikingly similar, crossing fire, passing through judgment, and finally being weighed by divine light. Vatican scholars who examined the document were forced to confront a possibility they had long resisted, that Egyptian spiritual literature had directly shaped early Christian eschatology. The treatise was never banned, but it was quietly moved to a restricted vault where it remains unread by modern theologians. What lingers is a question that has haunted the Church's inner circles for centuries.
If ancient Egypt described the afterlife with such eerie precision, how did they know? Were they guessing, imagining, or remembering something the rest of the world had forgotten? The divine bridge of the text may not exist in stone, but in symbolism it stretches across time, connecting papyrus to parchment, pyramid to altar. And the Vatican, in choosing to hide it, may have feared not heresy, but recognition. In 1893, during a reorganization of the Vatican's missionary reports from Africa and the Middle East, a clerk named Paolo Santoy came across a dusty leather folder marked Requisition Luxurensis. Inside was a set of handwritten reports dating back to 1704, when a group of Carmelite missionaries stationed near Luxor had investigated local claims of a living god's tomb. These were not Coptic legends or references to mummified kings. The accounts described an underground chamber that emitted light without flame. Deep beneath the ruins of a collapsed temple believed to have once served the cult of Horus, the missionaries, wary of local guides, approached the story as superstition until they saw it. The final field report, written in Latin, speaks of a stone chamber inscribed with symbols glowing faintly under no known fire, as though the sun itself were sealed inside.
The priests, frightened, fled the site and marked it on an incomplete map, a copy of which remains in the Vatican's restricted cartography division. What happened to the original site remains unknown. Earthquakes, tomb robbers, and local silences may have erased it, but the story did not vanish. Decades later, in 1926, a Vatican engineer tasked with cataloging anomalous relics referenced the same file when testing early electric bulbs. His notes included a curious phrase, not invention, but rediscovery. While mainstream Egyptology dismisses such claims as fantasy, the Vatican's continued classification of the folder suggests it has never quite let go of the possibility that ancient Egypt possessed forms of energy or symbolism that transcended its time. Whether the living tomb was real or metaphor, the fear it inspired was genuine. In a faith where divine light represents God's presence, the idea that Egypt once summoned radiance from stone was too much to accept, and so the documents were locked away. Another flare of ancient brilliance dimmed behind Roman doors. In 1811, a Benedictine scholar named Brother Alaric Werner was granted limited access to a collection of untranslated scrolls held within the Vatican's private Oriental repository, a sealed room that housed texts gathered from centuries of Teenish missions across North Africa and the Near East. Among these, Werner found a scroll labeled Scriptum de Verbo Gesti, writing on the heavenly word. The scroll, copied in Arabic but clearly derived from earlier Egyptian sources, described an esoteric tradition surrounding the power of sacred speech. In its verses, uttered sound was more than communication. It was creation. Specific vibrations were said to realign the soul, cleanse the body, and open gateways between realms. The scroll contained diagrams of mouth positions annotated with sun and star symbols, and bore strong resemblance to phonetic notations used in early Semitic and Coptic chant. Werner, intrigued, drew parallels between the Egyptian invocation rites and the Christian concept of the Logos, the Word made flesh. He began drafting a theological paper arguing that the Egyptian temple priests may have practiced a form of proto-sacramental language that predates Christian liturgy. His work was never published. After submitting his notes to the Vatican's Congregation for Rites, he was ordered to halt all translations. The scroll was reclassified and placed under Index Reconditus, a category reserved for materials deemed theologically disruptive but not heretical. Werner, disillusioned, retired to a small abbey near Salzburg and never wrote again. Yet the idea lingered. If the Logos was not born in the deserts of Judea, but whispered first in the courts of Horus, what then does it mean for Christ to be the Word? Is the divine speech a universal current or a solitary spark? The Church never answered. It simply locked away the scroll, and with it, a vision of language that may have bridged pyramids and cathedrals with nothing more than breath. In the mid-1700s, a Jesuit antiquarian named Father Marcello Ventura cataloged an unusual item received from a merchant vessel docking in Naples. It was a small, unmarked box wrapped in sailcloth, said to have come from an excavation site along the Nile near Asute. Inside was a bronze mirror tarnished with age, its handle carved with lotus flowers and crowned with the unmistakable face of Hathor, the Egyptian goddess of joy, love, and resurrection. One cardinal reportedly asked whether the Vatican should continue housing mirrors that show our own face too clearly. The ladder of fire remains unread by modern eyes, sealed behind the marble calm of a city that prefers its dead to stay quiet. But in its silence, the scroll burns on, its vision of judgment not as punishment, but as memory returning to light. In the early 1800s, as Napoleon scholars were cataloging the remains of ancient Thebes, the Vatican dispatched one of its own, Monsignor Giulio Bernardi, a linguist with a reputation for discretion. He was instructed to follow the French expedition closely, not to interfere, but to observe. What Bernardi returned with was not a crate of artifacts, but a single book, carefully wrapped in black cloth and accompanied by a short note written in his own hand. This must not be read without fasting. The manuscript, which now resides in the Vatican's Collectio Obscura, is referred to as Liber Terram Veritatis, the Book of the Dark Truth. Though never displayed publicly, descriptions of its contents survive in internal reports. The text is written in a strange script, resembling late Coptic, with Egyptian logs inserted intermittently. Its central claim is startling, that the world was not created once, but continuously, through ritual and observation. Each day, the book claims, must be spoken into order.
Mirrors such as this were common in temple rites, used not only for grooming, but for rituals of reflection, both literal and metaphysical. But this one was different. According to Ventura's private notes, when exposed to flame or sunlight, the mirror briefly revealed strange symbols across its surface, markings not visible in ordinary conditions. He believed they were a script related to the so-called language of light, a term used in some Coptic mystical writings to describe divine communication through vision. The artifact was quickly removed from general review and placed under ecclesiastical protection. Though no formal record appears in published inventories, a faded reference to the mirror survives in the margins of the Liber Obscurus, a Vatican registry of perilous or untested relics. What makes this mirror so unsettling is not its age or its symbolism, but what it implied to the few who studied it, that ancient Egyptians may have possessed not only physical tools, but a system of perceptual enhancement linked to consciousness and ritual. The mirror was not just a reflection of the self, but a portal into meaning. Some within the Church speculated that such devices, if real, posed a threat to sacramental uniqueness. Others wondered if early Christian mystics inherited similar practices through desert ascetics who had once lived among temple ruins. The artifact has never been displayed, and its surface, now dulled by time and secrecy, remains unseen. But somewhere in the archives, the face of Hathor still lies hidden behind bronze, waiting, perhaps, for someone brave enough to look. In 1092, Amid rising European interest in spiritualism and ancient mysticism, the Vatican quietly convened a private commission to review a group of recently acquired scrolls from a Coptic monastery near Aswan. These scrolls, written in a mixture of Sahidic Coptic and late demonic Egyptian, were catalogued under the vague title Document Fibrea non Anochica non Canonicala, literary documents. Among them was a text known to church archivists today simply as the Ladder of Fire. Its contents defied easy classification. The text described in visionary language the soul's ascent through 7 thresholds after death, each guarded by a deity whose identity blurred the lines between Egyptian netters and archangelic forms found in early apocryphal Christianity. At the 3rd gate, a being with a falcon's head and a flaming sword weighed the soul's memory, not its deeds. At the 6th, the soul passed through light so intense it burned away speech, leaving only intent. The 7th, known only as the Eye, did not judge at all. It merely watched. The scroll's final passage declared that to ascend is to remember, and that death was not an ending, but the recovery of a name lost in the womb. Church scholars were unsettled. Theological overlaps with Christian mysticism were undeniable, but worse, the text hinted that early Christian visions of heaven, particularly those found in the Apocalypse of Peter and the Ascension of Isaiah, may have evolved from older Egyptian metaphysical systems. The Church never condemned the scroll outright, but access was swiftly restricted.
It slips into chaos. The text is filled with invocations to ancient deities, but framed in a liturgical structure eerily similar to the Catholic Mass, complete with offertory phrases, prayers of protection, and a final passage resembling a benediction, though addressed to the one behind the sun. What disturbed Vatican theologians most was not the presence of pagan elements, but their precision. The rituals followed solar alignments, planetary cycles, and specific bodily postures that mirrored early Christian devotional gestures. Some believed the book represented a pre-Christian priesthood that understood time, worship, and matter in ways that threatened Rome's claims to spiritual primacy. Bernardi's health reportedly declined after reading the manuscript. He entered a monastery shortly after his return and never spoke of Egypt again. Today, Liber Tenebrarum Veritatis sits sealed in a lightless drawer, its pages untouched, but its implications still looming. Not because it preaches heresy, but because it suggests the ritual heart of Christianity may have been lit long before the Gospels. In 1859, the Vatican received a quiet donation from a dying Italian collector who had once served as a diplomat in Alexandria. Among the assorted artifacts and scroll fragments was a single wax-sealed cylinder, its papyrus interior remarkably well preserved. It contained a liturgical hymn unlike anything found in either Roman or Eastern Christian tradition. Written in a blend of Koine Greek and older Egyptian syntax, the hymn invoked the voice of the buried sun and described a moment at dusk when all things, souls, and shadows to remember their origin.
What made this fragment extraordinary was not only its language, but the musical notation that accompanied it. Carefully etched above the lines were tonal symbols laid out in a form that matched early Byzantine neumes, the precursor to modern musical notation in the Christian West. But these symbols were older, more geometric, and arranged in a spiral. When reconstructed by a Vatican cantor in 180–91, the melody produced was haunting, neither major nor minor, but floating in tonal ambiguity. Listeners described an eerie sensation, as if the sound bent time, calling something forward rather than simply echoing back. The manuscript was promptly moved to the Office of Liturgical Doctrine and never sung again. Internal correspondence reveals concern that the hymn's theological content's implication, that divine memory predates both scripture and sacrament, was incompatible with the Church's doctrinal rhythm. Yet it was not destroyed. Instead, it was labeled Cantatum Caesi Solis, the Song of the Blind Sun, and stored in the Archives' acoustic reliquary alongside band chants and disavowed musical experiments. The song's final line reads, "Let the shadows sing back to the light." For some, it was poetic heresy. For others, a glimpse of a time when Egypt sang its faith into stone, into silence, into sky, and perhaps into Rome, not by force, but by sound. In the spring of 1097, as Napoleon's army marched toward Rome and revolution hung thick in the air, a small cadre of Vatican officials gathered in a candlelit chamber beneath the Apostolic Palace to secure what they called the volatile texts. Among the dozen items relocated that night was a single folio wrapped in faded red silk and bearing a papal seal dated to 1523. Its contents were known only to a few, though referenced obliquely in the Annals Sacrae Atticani as the Egyptian Testament of the Heart. The manuscript, translated from a now-lost scroll recovered from near Edfu, described a ritual known as weighing the silence, sea rite, in which a person stood in total stillness while their heart was placed symbolically upon a scale not to be judged by a deity, but to measure its alignment with divine rhythm. It was a ceremony not of punishment, but of resonance. The closer the soul's frequency matched that of cosmic balance, Mahata, easier its passage into eternity. What unsettled the Church was not just the rite's elegance, but its theology. Here was a system in which salvation did not require intercession or priesthood, but self-harmony. No sacraments, no confessions, just silence and truth. More disturbingly, the manuscript included annotations made by a 15th-century monk who had compared the Egyptian rite with medieval Catholic practices of contemplative stillness, particularly those of the Carthusians.
His conclusion was brief but bold. This is the same path, only older. After the French incursion was repelled, the folio was not returned to its original archive. Instead, it was buried deeper. Today, it sits beneath layers of classification, untouched, its silk wrapping still intact. Few know of it, fewer speak of it. But in the quiet folds of that manuscript lies a truth the Vatican could not burn. That some souls once approached the divine not with voices raised, but with hearts hushed, waiting only to be weighed by silence.
In 1078, an envoy from the Maronite Church delivered to the Vatican a carved sandstone tablet discovered in the ruins of a forgotten temple near the ancient city of Akhmim. The object, worn but legible, depicted a seated figure believed to be the god Thoth, scribe of the gods and guardian of sacred knowledge, flanked by two priests holding styluses and palm leaves. But it was not the imagery that troubled the Vatican scholars. It was the inscription beneath, translated by a Jesuit linguist shortly after its arrival. The text read, "That which is written must be rewritten. That which is spoken must be returned." At first glance, the phrase could be interpreted as a poetic proverb, but accompanying notes from the original Maronite curator suggested it formed part of a larger doctrine. The idea that true knowledge is not static, but cyclical, transmitted, forgotten, recovered, and returned. This concept deeply unnerved the Church's theologians, particularly those responsible for maintaining the immutability of Scripture. In Christian doctrine, divine revelation is final. There is no return, no rewriting. To acknowledge a spiritual tradition where truth evolves across ages through forgotten temples, hidden texts, and remembered speech would be to undermine the finality of the Gospels. The Vatican acted quickly.
The tablet was removed from the museum's circuit, its existence documented only in an internal file marked Thoth Reversio. One cardinal privately noted the danger of what he called temporal relativism of the soul, the idea that humanity's search for truth is not a straight line, but a spiral. Some whispered that the priests of Thoth saw history not as events, but as echoes, and that what was once known would always be known again. The Church, committed to doctrine that travels forward and upward, could not entertain such an orbit. And so the tablet, though made of stone, was treated like fire, too old, too bright, and too willing to return. In 1867, a dusty crate marked only with the word Memphis arrived at the Vatican from a Jesuit outpost in Cairo. Inside was a fragment of what appeared to be an Egyptian ritual garment. Thin linen, delicately embroidered with both hieroglyphic script and geometric patterns resembling early Christian crosses. Accompanying the cloth was a letter from Father Emiliano Serra, who had retrieved it from a collapsed chamber beneath the Saqqara necropolis. He believed it to be part of a vestment once worn by a priest of Ptah, the creator god of Memphis. What caught Serra's attention, however, was not the artifact's age or craftsmanship. It was the ritual instructions sewn into its border. In a faint but legible hand, it read, "To wear this is to become the axis. To breathe is to connect heaven to the ground." These phrases bore an uncanny resemblance to the language of the Catholic Mass, especially the priest's role as mediator between the divine and the earthly. Serra, a devout and cautious man, confessed in his letter, "The garment mirrors our vestments in function and perhaps in origin." His findings were received with silence. The textile was placed under ecclesiastical quarantine, and Sarah was reassigned within the year. Subsequent analysis by Vatican textile conservators confirmed the linen's authenticity, dating it to the early New Kingdom period. Yet no public mention was ever made of it. The robe, now stored in a climate-controlled case, remains officially uncategorized. For the Church, the parallels were too precise. Egyptian priests, long dismissed as pagans and idol worshippers, had apparently conducted rites whose gestures, garments, and theological aims echoed those later practiced in cathedrals. To acknowledge this would raise questions about continuity, not of institution, but of essence. Was the act of divine mediation always clothed in white, always whispered across thresholds, long before Rome laid its first stone? If so, then the sacred thread binding priest to altar may stretch further back than the Church dares to trace.
In 1932, under the authority of Pope Pius XI, a small group of scholars from the Pontifical Biblical Institute was granted provisional access to a sealed dossier known only as Verba Egyptorum, the words of the Egyptians. The file had been kept under ecclesiastical restriction since the early 1600s and was rumored to contain transcriptions of oral testimonies gathered from Egyptian temple descendants during the Crusader period. What the scholars found were not myths or invocations, but aphorisms, succinct theological reflections spoken by unnamed sages whose ancestry allegedly traced back to the priesthood of Heliopolis. One fragment read, "To know God is not to name him, but to remember the place where you last forgot." Another, "What cannot be held in language must be held in ritual." These expressions echoed core themes in Christian mysticism, particularly those espoused by figures like Meister Eckhart or Saint John of the Cross, who spoke of divine silence, interior darkness, and the inadequacy of words before God. But these Egyptian sayings predated those Christian mystics by over 1,000 years. The scholars prepared a brief internal report and proposed that the fragments be classified as proto-philosophical and studied further. Instead, the entire dossier was reclassified under obscure, non-declare materials not to be disclosed. The reasoning, though not written formally, was clear. If the wisdom of the ancients mirrored the contemplative heights of Christian mysticism, then perhaps the spiritual ascent toward God was not uniquely Christian, but universal, discovered again and again by seekers in temples, deserts, and hidden schools long before the Church was born. One theologian wrote privately, "It is not that they reached the same summit, it is that they climbed from the other side." The Church chose silence. The words of Egypt, though translated, were never spoken aloud again. But still they wait tucked in drawers beneath Rome's golden halls. Testaments not to heresy, but to the quiet memory of truth spoken long before the cross. In 1614, a papal librarian named Father Silvano Cordelli was tasked with evaluating a shipment of manuscripts acquired from a Venetian trader who claimed to have received them from monks in the Wadi Natan region of Egypt. Most of the documents were worn Coptic sermons and monastic rules, unremarkable save for one vellum-bound volume titled Deo Subterraneo, of the Subterranean Kingdom. The text was anonymous and undated, but its pages described in obsessive detail a vast system of underground chambers and passageways said to stretch beneath the Nile, connecting temples, tombs, and sanctuaries in a network of symbolic geometry. The writer insisted that this labyrinth was not simply a physical construction, but a mirror of the soul's descent into self, where each chamber represented a trial of memory, fear, and silence. Within one of these imaginatory remembered chambers, the author described a stone marked with 7 concentric circles, each labeled with names of virtues and vices in both Greek and Egyptian glyphs. At the center was a single unmarked eye. The Vatican scholars reviewing the manuscript noted with concern that the structure bore similarities to the medieval Christian concept of purgatoris, specifically Dante's Purgatorio, which was published nearly 3 centuries before. The parallels were unnerving. Had Egypt envisioned a purgative afterlife long before Christian theology formalized it? Had monks in the desert preserved that map in secret? And more disturbingly, had someone in Europe read it before Dante wrote his verses? The manuscript was never condemned, but it was never cited again. Father Cordelli's notes were brief. An architecture of the soul too vast for doctrine. Dredno Subterraneo now lies filed in a drawer marked Fabula Theologicae, alongside texts the Church could neither affirm nor erase. Whether the labyrinth was metaphor, memory, or something real is no longer the question. What matters is that someone once believed the soul did not rise in a straight line, but descended first, deep and alone, through the earth of its own history. In the summer of 1765, a Franciscan monk named Brother Eusebio Mancini returned from a pilgrimage through Alexandria bearing a relic he had not intended to bring. Hidden inside a rolled tapestry purchased from a street vendor was a strip of aged papyrus, so brittle it nearly disintegrated in his hands.
The ink, however, was still visible, and black glyphs arranged in solemn lines interspersed with the occasional symbol for breath, fire, and eye. Upon arrival in Rome, Brother Mancini handed it over to the Vatican's Curia with a modest note, found unexpectedly. Speaks of stillness. The scroll was translated months later by a Coptic-trained Jesuit who titled it The Prayer Without Sound. The text was unlike any Egyptian hymn known to scholars. It instructed the initiate to prepare not with offerings, incense, or chants, but with stillness, interior silence, and the absence of spoken petition. The gods hear not the mouth, it said, but the breath held between fear and memory. The scroll emphasized not devotion through performance, but communion through surrender. The final line read, "When you become the quiet, the voice will find you." Vatican theologians were unsettled. The document mirrored the contemplative practices of Christian mystics like the Desert Fathers, who sought God not through words, but through wordless waiting. That a similar theology of interior presence had existed in Egypt undermined the assumption that Christian contemplative prayer emerged solely from Judeo-Christian roots. The prayer was never published. It was labeled a liturgical anomaly and filed in the Archivum Quietis, a sub-collection reserved for non-liturgical devotions with unstable doctrinal value. But even there, among fragments no one reads, the silent prayer remains fragile, forgotten, and yet somehow familiar. It speaks not through proclamation, but through the empty space it leaves behind, a space the Church has long tried to fill with hymns, chants, and sermons. But Egypt's voice in this scroll does not speak at all. It waits. In 1888, as Vatican archaeologists continued their discreet study of Egyptian Christian ruins, a sealed letter arrived at the Secretariat of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. It bore no return address, only the word Thebes in faded ink, and enclosed within it was a single page of parchment carefully preserved between two sheets of linen. The text was written in early Sahidic Coptic and bore the title Epistenu Photu, the Epistle of the Dark Light. It read more like a poem than a letter, and though brief, its message was as enigmatic as it was haunting. It spoke of a light that does not shine but reveals, and a fire that does not burn but remembers. It described a presence hidden beneath temples and cathedrals alike, older than books, older than names, and ended with a final line that lingered. We were not the first to kneel. Scholars within the Vatican debated its origin. Some believed it to be a Christian-era apocryphal text, possibly Gnostic, possibly poetic metaphor. But others recognized in it something older, something that carried the cadence and vision of pre-Christian Egyptian theology, where light was not merely illumination, but the unveiling of hidden order. The text made no direct challenge to Catholic doctrine. It simply suggested a longer story, one in which humans had sought the divine in many temples through many fires long before Scripture was canonized. Rather than risk theological ambiguity, the letter was placed in a private archive labeled Lucerne Negate, the Denied Lamps. No official record was made public. And yet its final message has stayed with those few who've read it. That Tanal is not invention, that awe was born in the dust of forgotten sanctuaries, that before the cross, before the creed, there were hands raised to the stars and breath held in silence, waiting for the same answer we still seek. The Church never answered the letter, but perhaps it never had to. Perhaps the epistle was never written for Rome at all, but for anyone who still listens in the dark. In 1924, under the guidance of the Vatican's Oriental Institute, a sealed clay jar was delivered to Rome from a Franciscan mission operating near Camombo. The jar, unearthed during a local construction project, contained a scroll written on what appeared to be treated palm fiber, denser and darker than papyrus. Its script was a hybrid of ancient Egyptian symbols and early Christian monograms, and its content defied easy categorization. The document, referred to in internal Vatican correspondence as Formula du Soleil, the blueprint of the House of Heaven, described in precise architectural language a sacred structure not built of stone, but memory, proportion, and sound. The writer, whose identity was left unnamed, claimed this temple could be accessed not physically, but ritually, through rhythmic steps, melodic breath, and measured stillness. The practitioner could walk its corridors, ascending through its invisible chambers toward divine contact. The blueprint described 7 levels, each with their own tonal key, and concluded with a chamber without name, without voice.
Where only truth may enter. Jesuit architects brought in to examine the scroll's geometric patterns noted strong similarities with sacred proportions found in both Gothic cathedrals and ancient Egyptian temples, particularly those dedicated to Horus and Ammon. Some within the church proposed that this document reflected a universal, mystical architecture that emerged in different ages under different names. But that suggestion was quickly silenced. To acknowledge that the Vatican's most sacred spaces echoed blueprints found in Egypt would be to admit that divine geometry was not revealed in a singular moment of Christian grace, but remembered from something older. And so, Formula Cully was sealed in the private vault of the Office of Sacred Architecture, and never mentioned again. The scroll remains intact. Its geometry remains untested. But those who have read it say the proportions hum with familiarity, as though every sacred space, cathedral, chapel, or chamber of the hearth always pointed toward the same invisible temple built beneath memory itself. In 1803, during a period of cautious détente between the Papal States and Napoleon's regime, a French officer turned antiquarian named Louis-Étienne de Voiture donated an unusual artifact to the Vatican in exchange for protection from charges of relic smuggling. The object, wrapped in waxed linen and bound with a cord of palm fiber, was a black onyx amulet carved in the shape of a seated lionette, its base etched with a phrase in demonic script that translated simply as, "He who guards the mouth of the sun." Voiture claimed the amulet had been found near the ruins of Leontopis, a site once sacred to the cult of the lion-headed goddess Sekhmet. Upon examination by Vatican scholars, it was discovered that the phrase matched a passage in a much older Egyptian-era text tone, rarely cited and never translated in full. The passage described a guardian at the threshold of spiritual knowledge, a being who did not protect the seeker from evil, but from too much light. In a parallel file within the Vatican Archives, marked Custodes Radioltis, was a brief commentary written in the mid-1500s by a Coptic monk who had fled Ottoman persecution and found refuge in Rome. He claimed that the Church's understanding of divine revelation was incomplete without knowledge of those who stand between light and blindness. The implication was subtle but dangerous. Not all spiritual knowledge, he warned, is meant to be received at once. Some must be tempered, filtered, guarded, lest it destroy. For centuries, the Church had taught that divine truth was a gift, fully revealed in Christ. But here, buried in an Egyptian amulet and an obscure monastic warning, was the idea that even divine light must be veiled, that mystery is not the absence of knowledge, but its mercy. The amulet was never displayed. It remains in a drawer lined with lead, lightless, untouched, perhaps not out of fear, but out of reverence. Some doors, after all, were never meant to open in daylight. In 1731, a Jesuit linguist named Father Ignazio Pellegrini completed a confidential report for the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith after returning from a 5-year mission in the Fayoum region of Egypt. Among the materials he submitted was a slim-bound volume titled Luria sub Rosa, Liturgies Beneath the Rose. The book contained a set of parallel texts, one side in early Coptic, the other in ecclesiastical Latin, carefully aligned line by line. The content was a comparative translation of ancient Egyptian hymns to the god Ammon, with Catholic prayers addressed to the Holy Spirit. Pellegrini's intent was scholarly, to demonstrate the possible linguistic evolution of theological vocabulary. But what he discovered unsettled his superiors. The hymns and prayers, separated by over a millennium, shared not only rhythm and tone, but metaphor. Both describe the divine as the breath who is not seen, the flame that teaches, and the voice who lives in silence. These were not superficial poetic coincidences. They revealed a conceptual lineage, perhaps an unconscious inheritance linking Egyptian temple worship to the inner language of Christian devotion. Pellegrini, in his commentary, posed a difficult question. Is it heresy to suggest that men have always prayed to the same fire, only by different names? The Vatican's response was swift. The report was classified. The translations archived under Varia Devotionalia non approbata, and Pellegrini was reassigned to administrative duties.
He died 2 years later, his study never published. The volume remains deep in the archive, its pages undisturbed, its message unspoken. But its implications linger, that perhaps what the Church came to call revelation was not a thunderclap in history, but the long echo of older voices, whispered in stone chambers, sung to gods with hidden names, and carried forward prayer by prayer into the sanctuaries of Rome. Not to challenge the divine, but to remember how many have tried to touch it. In 1695, the Vatican received a set of scrolls smuggled out of a Nubian monastery near the ancient Egyptian border of Elephantine. The courier, a Maronite trader named Ias Davis, had been paid to retrieve theological texts thought to have been lost since the fall of the Christian kingdom of Makakaria centuries earlier. What he delivered was far more unusual. The scrolls, written in Coptic with Nubian glosses, contained a hybrid cosmology in which the resurrection of the body was not a future event, but a daily spiritual labor. One passage read, The bones awaken when the breath remembers. Another described the soul not as a singular essence, but as a composite of parts: light, name, shadow, and silence, each requiring its own purification. These ideas, though foreign to Catholic doctrine, bore striking resemblance to Egyptian funerary beliefs, stretching back to the Book of the Dead. But here, they had been reframed in Christian terms. The resurrection not as a divine reward, but as an internal alignment with divine order, forged in life through suffering, solitude, and memory. A Vatican theologian reviewing the documents in 1701 noted privately, "It is as if Christ walked once through Egypt. Some part of Egypt listened longer than we knew." The scrolls were classified and stored under Doctrina Extra Canonem, a category reserved for theological texts deemed non-heretical, yet incompatible with official teaching. The Church made no public mention of the Nubian cosmology. Perhaps it was afraid that if the faithful learned resurrection had once been practiced, not promised, the future of the soul would no longer belong solely to the Church. And yet the scrolls endure, shelved in a quiet chamber beneath frescoed ceilings. They remain unspoken, unread, but their vision is clear, that to be reborn is not to wait for heaven, but to awaken here, now, piece by piece, under the eyes of gods and saints who still remember the shape of the soul. In 1839, during a quiet recataloguing of neglected missionary records, a young archivist named Giovanni Leone stumbled upon a document that had gone unexamined for over a century. It was a travel account written by a Dominican friar stationed briefly in Esna, a city in Upper Egypt known for its still-standing temple to the god Khnum. The friar, whose name appears only as Brother H, described a local legend passed down among the remaining priestly families in the region. The tale spoke of a lost text known as the Book of the One Who Waits, a volume said to contain dialogues between a mortal and a hidden deity who would not speak unless asked in silence. The priest described rituals of unspoken prayer, the use of darkness to prepare the mind, and a symbol drawn in ash, a circle, broken only at the east where light rises. What drew Vatican attention, however, was not the legend itself, but the friar's observation that these practices bore a striking resemblance to certain early Christian hesychastic traditions, forms of contemplative prayer rooted in inner stillness common among Eastern monks. The idea that an Egyptian spiritual framework may have seeded or mirrored these practices was met with immediate resistance. The report was never formally entered into the Vatican's main archive. Instead, it was filed in a side collection known internally as Res Similitudinem, Matters of Resemblance. Its title alone signaled discomfort. The Church could tolerate similarity in art, even in ritual, but resemblance in prayer, especially in how the soul approaches God, risked undermining the claim of revealed uniqueness. And yet the story remains, fragile and yellowing, the broken circle still traced in the margins. What if the divine does not favor novelty? What if the truest prayers were always the oldest, the quiet ones, spoken with no tongue, offered beneath both sun and cross, and heard only by the one who waits? In 1748, a Vatican scribe cataloging relics for the Office of Sacred Rites uncovered a peculiar item missiled among the annals of early Christian martyrdoms.
It was a narrow bronze plate, no larger than a human palm, engraved on both sides. One side depicted a stylized cross, its arms subtly curved, not unlike the ancient Egyptian Ankh. The other side bore a short inscription in Coptic: "Life opens not through death, but through offering." The plate had no accompanying record, but an old tag still clung to it, brittle and faded, with the name Pacom scratched faintly across the back, a likely reference to Saint Pachomius, the founder of communal monasticism in Egypt during the 4th century. Scholars who later reviewed the object noted that the cross was not just an artistic variation. It had been carved deliberately to blend Christian and Egyptian symbology, as if to suggest continuity rather than contradiction. The Ankh, known in Egyptian belief as the key of life, was long regarded by the Church as a pagan distortion of the true cross. And yet here it was, humbly held, carefully preserved, and buried within Christian relics. It is unclear who made it, or why it was hidden, but the message it carried could not have been clearer, that at least one early Christian monk saw the two symbols not as rivals, but as siblings. The implications were theologically disruptive. If the cross was not a rejection of the Ankh, it carried more borrowed memory than divine invention. The bronze plate was never displayed. It rests now in a velvet box within a drawer of instrumenta non exhibita, its fusion of iconography sealed away like a confession. But even in silence, it whispers that perhaps the first Christians in Egypt did not tear down every temple. Some instead lit their candles beside old ones, believing the divine had not changed, only moved. In 1970, during a private study of the Vatican's restricted ethnographic collections, a Dominican scholar named Father Lucian Darcy encountered an ivory token, small, circular, and carved with a design so delicate it was almost missed. On one side was the figure of a bird, wings outstretched with a crown of reeds above its head. On the other was a Latin inscription added centuries later: Memorialia Aloram, memory of wings. Tucked beside the token in its archival pouch was a handwritten note dated to the 16th century. It claimed the object had been recovered from a cave near Aswan by a monk fleeing Ottoman incursion. The token, it said, had been used in a ritual known as the Flight Without Sky, a contemplative exercise practiced by Egyptian ascetics who believed the soul could ascend without dying through silence, fasting, and the abandonment of earthly names. What struck Father Darcy was the profound resemblance this ritual bore to early Christian accounts of an anastasis, a spiritual resurrection prior to physical death. It is echoed in the writings of desert mystics like Evagrius Ponticus and Isaac the Syrian. Both traditions described a kind of internal ascent, the soul rising not into heaven, but into clarity. If the Egyptian rite was indeed older, then Christian mysticism had not emerged from nothing. It had found fertile ground where such practices already existed. The Church, faced with these uncomfortable parallels, chose to file the token in a sealed drawer within the Archivum Orationis Obdironidi, Archive of Hidden Prayer. There it remains, unspoken of in public doctrine, its wings folded in ivory. It is not a relic of heresy, nor a threat to belief, but it is a reminder, retched in silence, that many have risen in spirit long before their time, and that the oldest flights did not begin with words, but with memory, breath, and a turning inward so complete it needed no sky. In 1786, while preparing a private collection for shipment to the Vatican Museum, a papal emissary stationed in Alexandria documented an object so strange it was nearly returned without examination. It was a flat, circular disc made of alabaster, no larger than a plate, with a polished surface so smooth it reflected the face with a slight distortion, curved, elongated, almost unrecognizable. Around its edge, however, were faint incisions, not hieroglyphs, but tiny pictograms of eyes, mouths, and ears alternating in a repeating pattern. The accompanying note, written in Arabic, referred to the disc as the listening mirror of Anubis. The Vatican's first assessment dismissed it as decorative, but when light from a candle passed over the surface, some claimed the reflections twisted, not unnaturally, but in patterns suggestive of movement, like sound vibrating through stillness. A Franciscan archivist with knowledge of Egyptian funerary rites suggested that the disc might have been used not to see the dead, but to hear them.
This interpretation was quietly recorded, then filed under Mirabilia Silencia, Wonders of Silence. What disturbed the Church was not the idea of communicating with the dead, which had long been condemned, but the possibility that the object served a ritual function of remembrance. Egyptian priests believed that the soul persisted through attention, that to be remembered was to remain partially alive. If this was true, then the mirror was not a portal but a vessel meant to reflect not the image of the viewer, but the trace of a voice long gone. Christian theology, while teaching eternal life, had always framed the dead as awaiting resurrection. But here was a relic suggesting the opposite, that eternity is not only granted by God, but preserved by human memory. The alabaster disc was never displayed. It remains locked in a lead-lined drawer, too strange to explain, too fragile to discard. And perhaps that is fitting. Some memories do not speak until we lean close enough to hear them, not with ears, but with reverence. In 1861, a small envelope arrived at the Vatican from a French missionary stationed in Mina, Egypt. Inside was a brittle scrap of parchment, no larger than a palm, bearing a diagram sketched in dark red ink. At its center was a spiral symbol, elegant, surrounded by 12 figures. These were not depictions of gods or apostles, but abstract silhouettes, each carrying a tool, a reed, a cup, a mirror, a flame. At the top of the parchment was a short line in Coptic, "The Watchers of the Returning Hour." The missionary's letter explained that the parchment had been found buried beneath a crumbling pillar of a ruined temple once dedicated to Thoth. Local monks claimed it was a map, not of a place, but of a moment. They believed it referred to a rare celestial alignment, a returning hour when divine presence became accessible through ritual. The tools, they said, were symbolic functions of the initiate: to write, to receive, to reflect, to illuminate. When Vatican scholars reviewed the parchment, they noticed something far more disquieting. The structure of the spiral, its proportions, and the placement of its 12 figures bore a striking resemblance to medieval Christian zodiac manuscripts found in the monastery libraries of Monte Cassino. One cardinal remarked that the parchment suggests a convergence too precise to be imagined, too distant to be uncomfortable. If both traditions, separated by geography and doctrine, had mapped spiritual time using the same form, then Egypt's conception of sacred rhythm had survived, disguised perhaps, but never forgotten. The document was placed into the Vatican's Chromphica Obscura, the archive of suppressed cosmologies. It remains there still, filed under silence, And yet the spiral persists, not just in drawings, but in architecture, liturgy, and even breath. It suggests that time, like truth, does not always move forward. Sometimes it circles back to meet us, quietly, faithfully, bringing with it voices we never meant to forget. In 1954, a Jesuit astronomer stationed at the Vatican Observatory in Castel Gandolfo made a quiet request to the Apostolic Archive.
He had been studying ancient star maps, both European and Egyptian, and was hoping to cross-reference a specific alignment noted in a 5th century manuscript from Alexandria. What he received after weeks of silence was a tightly sealed folio marked Sub Oculus Caeli, under the eyes of heaven. Inside was a set of folded vellum sheets bearing star charts far older than the Christian era. These charts, preserved with stunning clarity, depicted the Egyptian night sky from the perspective of Heliopolis. But what made them extraordinary were the annotations added centuries later in Latin. Whoever copied them had drawn faint Christian crosses in the margins next to certain constellations. The star known today as Sirius had been circled and labeled Angelus Luciferos, light-bringing angel. And Orion's belt was flanked by notes about resurrection, radiance, and the return of the king. The alignment being studied, the astronomer noted, would next occur in the year 2012. Years surrounded by global fascination, apocalyptic predictions, and esoteric theories. The charts had apparently been reviewed by scholars during the Council of Trent, though no official record of this appears in public documentation. What unsettled the Jesuit most was not the overlap in astronomical knowledge, but the tone of the annotations. They did not seem skeptical or corrective. They were reverent, as if whoever had inscribed the Latin understood the Egyptian cosmology not as heresy, but as parallel revelation.
The idea that God might have written the same truths into different skies through different languages without contradiction. The folio was quietly returned and reshelved. No public paper was ever written. But in the Jesuits' notebook, one line remains uncensored. The stars do not convert, they remember. In this final turning of sky and scripture, Egypt had not opposed Christianity. It had been its shadow twin, watching, recording, and waiting for the time when heaven's map would be read again without fear. In 1932, a visiting scholar from the Coptic Orthodox Church was granted limited access to the Vatican's private linguistic collection. His request was simple: to study regional dialects of pre-Islamic Egyptian Christian texts preserved in Rome. But during his visit, he was accidentally handed a file mislabeled under early Syriac fragments. Inside was a transcription so old and unfamiliar that it took him several minutes to recognize it not as a regional dialect, but as a form of hieratic Egyptian fused with Greek syntax. The document appeared to be a sermon, or perhaps a theological poem, in which a divine figure described its body not as singular, but composed of multiple names, each buried in a different temple across the land of the Nile. The scholar, stunned, asked to see the original manuscript. He was told none existed, only this copy remained, handwritten centuries later by a monk whose name was lost to time. When he questioned the origin of the document,
the archivist changed the subject. Later that evening, the scholar returned to his guest quarters to find a note slipped under the door. It read, "Some names are not forgotten, only buried." The scholar made no further inquiries. He returned to Egypt within the week and never published the fragment. But in a letter to a colleague preserved now in Cairo, he wrote, "I have seen something more ancient than any of our books. It speaks in voices I did not know the Church remembered, and yet there it was, speaking still." Today, the file remains stored in the Lingua Vadis Obscura section of the archive, its existence unacknowledged in any catalogue. What it offers is not proof of divine origin, but evidence of memory. How faith, like language, bends and survives, layering tongues atop each other until the original prayer is no longer spoken, but still felt. In the shadows of the Vatican, Egypt speaks, not loudly, but with the patience of stone. In 1614, during the papacy of Paul V, a cardinal working under the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith received a sealed crate marked simply with the initials AM. No official records exist explaining how it arrived in Rome, but the inventory made by the cardinal's scribe listed its contents in careful script. One statue, one scroll, and a small vial of black resin sealed in wax. The statue, carved from basalt, depicted a human figure with the head of a lioness. The scroll was written in Demotic Egyptian, and the vialo, no larger than a finger, was labeled Re Sanguinis Bastat, the matter of Bastat's blood. The statue was clearly a representation of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess associated with divine wrath and healing. But the scroll revealed a far more complex theology. It spoke of a ritual where the blood of the goddess, if awakened during certain lunar phases, would bring either destruction or clarity. What stunned the cardinal was the comparison made in the marginal Latin notes added later by a Jesuit. The writer drew links between the figure of Sekhmet and the imagery of the Book of Revelation, the woman clothed with the sun, crowned with stars, who brings both agony and redemption. In Egyptian theology, Sekhmet could annihilate or renew. In Christian eschatology, the woman could deliver the Savior or witness the end. Both divine, both dangerous. The parallels were too explicit to ignore. The scroll and vial were never destroyed, but they were never discussed again. They were locked in a wooden reliquary labeled non ad publicandum, not for publication. Today, that crate still exists in a subterranean vault beneath the archive's eastern wing. What it contains may not be literal blood, but symbolic danger. A reminder that femininity and divinity, when entwined, have always unsettled those who write doctrine. Egypt remembered this. The Vatican, perhaps, still does. And deep in its archives, where dust clings to secrets like incense to silk, the goddess waits, unclaimed, unnamed, but not unrecorded. In 1859, a Benedictine monk tasked with transcribing texts from the suppressed Index Laborum Prohibitorum stumbled upon a manuscript misfiled under medieval heresies.
Bound in goat leather and marked with an unfamiliar sigilla, a stylized lotus growing from a crucifix bore no author's name. The first pages were in Latin, but gradually shifted into Greek, then into what scholars would later identify as late Egyptian Demotic. The manuscript, now known internally
as Cex Amentes, contained a single narrative told in fragments. It described a figure known only as the Dreaming King, who descended into the underworld, not to judge the dead, but to ask their forgiveness. Along his journey, he encountered scribes who wrote memories into stone, priests who baptized shadows, and a lion who wept at sunrise. The tale bore unmistakable echoes of the Osiris myth, but layered with Christian motifs: resurrection, humility, a kingdom not of earth. What unsettled Vatican readers most was the final passage. It claimed that when the dreaming king awoke, he found himself in a temple made of mirrors, where every wall reflected not his divinity, but the faces of those who remembered him. The Church had long taught that memory is earthly and God is eternal. But here, memory itself seemed divine, a sacred force preserving the past, not as record, but as presence. The Codex Amentes remained sealed to this day, but its reflection lingers, because even the most forbidden stories do not disappear. They wait, like forgotten kings, live in the minds of those who dared to remember. In 1927, a Jesuit historian, cataloging a collection of marginalia from suppressed texts, encountered a peculiar annotation, scrawled into the binding of a 17th century homily. It wasn't a note or a citation, but a question. What if Egypt remembered Christ before Bethlehem? The ink had faded, and the handwriting bore signs of haste, almost fear. Curious, the historian searched for its author and traced it to a little-known monk named Father Calino, who decades earlier had been exiled to a remote outpost near Lake Nemi.
Further investigation into Calino's work revealed a trove of personal notebooks, never published, containing translations of Egyptian temple inscriptions discovered in 1894. These inscriptions referred to a figure called the Weeping God, who walked with the poor, and a ritual in which bread was broken in his name. To Calino, this was no coincidence. He believed these rituals were spiritual precursors, echoes of the divine pattern that Christianity would later formalize. But rather than glorifying syncretism, his writings struck a quieter tone of awe, sorrow, and tension. If ancient Egypt carried fragments of the sacred story long before it was canonized, what did that mean for the Church's monopoly on salvation? The Vatican swiftly confiscated Calino's work, citing doctrinal instability. But within the archives, his notebooks were preserved, not destroyed. They sit today in a sealed drawer labeled Premissa Veritatis, that which came before truth. The label is telling. It doesn't deny the Church's truth, but it subtly acknowledges the possibility that truth is layered, not linear. Egypt may not have known Jesus, but perhaps it knew his shape, his hunger, his suffering, his forgiveness, long before the Gospels were written. And maybe that's what frightened those who read Calino's pages most. Not heresy, but familiarity. The realization that across time and sand and language, humanity has always been reaching for the same light. And sometimes it shines brightest in the places we were told to forget.
In a quiet corner of the Vatican Archives, beneath a cracked fresco depicting Saint Jerome wrestling with scripture, there's a cabinet that bears no catalogue number. Archivists call it Arca Mutath, silent chest. Its contents are rarely discussed, even among those who know of its existence. But in 1973, a single document from that chest was briefly reviewed during a closed session of the Pontifical Biblical Commission. The paper was not ancient, but modern, 1948, typed in Italian and unsigned. Its subject line read, "Final Note on Egyptian Continuities." The note contained no dogma, no theological assertions, only a list. At the top were Egyptian terms, Maat, Ka, Duat, Peret. Next to each was its nearest Christian counterpart, justice, soul, afterlife, resurrection. At the bottom of the page, a single line had been added in pencil. All names are veils. The light behind them does not change. The meeting minutes make no mention of this note being read aloud. It was returned to the chest that evening and never cited again. But the phrase itself fits weight. Its quiet defiance remains, because after 54 chapters of veiled histories and buried manuscripts, it becomes clear that the greatest secret was never a relic or a letter. It was the idea that divinity does not belong to a single tongue or temple, that what the Egyptians preserved in granite and gold, the Vatican preserved in ink and silence, and both, in their way, were guardians of a mystery too large for one story alone. In the end, Egypt's greatest legacy may not be its gods, its kings, or its monuments. It may be its patience, its ability to bury truths not out of fear, but faith, that someday, somewhere, they would be heard again. And now, as these archives slowly open, as ancient names flicker back into our collective memory, perhaps the silence is lifting. Perhaps the light behind the veils is beginning to speak once more.